Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we got a package we're going to be looking at. This comes from Marseille Inc. The name might sound familiar. They made this. This is the mCable. I've done several videos on this thing, and this is the latest product they've got. So before we go into it, a little brief history here. The mCable, I made multiple videos on, and the first time I heard about it, I thought it was like snake oil. I thought it was stupid. I couldn't believe that that was like a thing they were trying to push, but it turns out it's totally real. So what is it? It's an HDMI cable that has a processor inside the cable, and it basically takes any signal you throw at it, redraws every pixel on the fly, and cleans up the resolution, enhances the image, removes jagged edges. You can kind of think of it like a magical external graphics card kind of housed within inside of an HDMI cable. Like I said, I've done several videos on it. I think it's an amazing piece of technology, and I'm super impressed with it. So again, you can go back, and it's really good at handling retro content, as well as it has diminishing returns on modern stuff, but it does a lot with classic stuff, which leads to this, which is their new products. We're going to go ahead and open it up here. They were cool enough to send this to me for free for the purposes of review, so I want to thank them for doing that. I got to check this thing out at E3. It's pretty neat, but like I said, their newest product wrapped up here. Let's get through the bubble wrap, and inside we have this. This is the mClassic. Now, the mClassic is basically the newest iteration, if you want to think of it that way, of the mCable. It's smaller, it has various changes made to it, but first of all, you'll notice based on the size that there is a difference. So let's talk about some of the obvious differences before we can even review the thing. First and foremost, it's no longer a cable. Rather than being, obviously, the mCable, the mClassic is, you can kind of think of it the way they describe it anyway, is basically like an external graphics card for video game consoles. It's housed within inside of a little shell, like a dongle. You plug that into the back of any sort of HDMI compliant device, namely a video game console or a PC, etc., and let it do some of the external graphics processing to make the games basically look better. So it's very similar to the mCable in that sense, except the delivery method is slightly different. And then it's got a couple of other features to it. First and foremost, it has a switch on the back, which they talk about right here. There's 3 modes of operation by the toggle, as they call it. There's the off mode, which was one of the biggest complaints with the mCable, which was if for some reason you had the cable set up into your television setup and everything, and you didn't want the processing, you didn't want the additional enhancements for whatever reason, whether it's compatibility issues or you didn't like the way it was doing something or whatever it is, the only option was to physically remove the entire cable from the setup. They decided to address that, so they have an off mode just in case you want to just bypass the signal. You no longer have to remove the thing from your setup, which is a nice feature. Then the middle switch is for the enhancements to be on. So that's when it does all of its anti-aliasing, buffering, it does the sharpening, it does the resolution upscaling, all the stuff, all the processing, all happens in the middle mode. And then the third mode is the one I'm actually super excited about. That's the retro mode. Now, as I understand it, the retro mode basically does everything the processing mode does, except it adjusts everything to a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now, the reason that's exciting is one of the things that was really great about the mCable is if you plugged it into, say, the GameCube, the Dreamcast, PS2, Xbox, provided you had appropriate HDMI adapters, if you will. If you did that, then the mCable did an amazing job of buffering them out and making them look really nice, but it, of course, was only designed for 16:9, so it would stretch the image. So then, if you wanted to have the gameplay look natural, you would have to adjust it on your television manually to 4:3, or you would have to, if you were like capturing footage or streaming or something like that, you'd have to deal with that problem in post-production. Well, they went ahead and solved that for everybody. They just put a retro mode right on there, so it adjusts the aspect ratio for you, which is really nice, especially for someone like me who would like to be able to capture footage or be able to just play it without having to constantly change it manually on my TV. I like that, just a little switch on there. And they list a whole bunch of consoles that it's compatible with. It says, PC gamers are able to upgrade their graphics card while console gamers have been limited by locked hardware. Not anymore. The mClassic is here to be the world's first add-on graphics processor for video game consoles. Yes, you read that right. The mClassic is like having a new graphics card without the hassle of modifying your game consoles. Then it lists a whole bunch of supported Nintendo Switch, Sony PlayStation, PS4, PS4 Slim, PS4 Pro, Xbox 360, PS3, Wii U, PlayStation 2, Microsoft Xbox, Xbox One, Xbox One S, Xbox One X, GameCube, original Xbox, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Sega Dreamcast. And it puts and many more. It says, and it has an asterisk saying retro consoles. Now, of course, That's mostly true. The problem is that only some of those are natively HDMI compliant. So for something like the GameCube, you would need like the GCHD, or with the Dreamcast, you need something like the Bahar Bros, like Gecko Box, you know, stuff like that. But once you have it set up for HDMI, you can plug this in and you're good to go. So let's take a look at the actual device here. Nice box there, very simple. And then we have the mClassic, which we pop right out there. Cool, nice little dongle thing. And then underneath we have a few things. We have an HDMI extender and a USB cable. So the USB cable is required for power, which makes sense. So in most modern consoles, that would be no big deal. You would just plug it in there and then plug it into the console and you're good to go. Something older, you'll have to find some sort of external USB source, whether it's like an actual USB to power supply, or you can plug it into something nearby. USB power supplies are not hard to find these days. Though I would recommend, I haven't tested this obviously, but I'm guessing you wouldn't want to power with the switch from time to time. The switch uses an odd voltage. I've noticed for different things. I hear that's what killed PlayStation Classics and things like that. So if you can plug it into something that isn't the Nintendo Switch, that's probably a good idea, at least for USB power purposes. Although maybe that's not that big of a deal, because obviously they did design it to work with the Switch, which is actually why I'm guessing they threw this in. An HDMI extension. The only obvious flaw to this thing just off the bat is the shape of it. It's going to fit in pretty much anything, but you can tell right away this is not going to fit in the Nintendo Switch dock, so that's why they would include an HDMI extender so that you're all set there. So that's cool of them to provide that. That way it definitely works on the Switch, and any other thing where it might just not quite fit the right way, you have some breathing room there. So that's cool of them to do. But yeah, so basically, in addition to the 3 modes, the other things they told me about this thing was they improved the algorithm in it, so it does more enhancements and it offers a better picture than the mCable did originally. That's like the technical stuff. The other thing, though, that's actually really cool, and they were super excited about this, is this thing supports 1440p upscaling, whereas the original mCable did not. It only supported 1080p upscaling, which is impressive. They showed me a demo of it. If you have a 1440p compatible monitor, then this thing can take stuff as low as 480p, upscale to 1440p. And let's not mince words here. That's not native resolution. Your GameCube isn't suddenly going to run natively in 1440p. But rather than just artificially stretching and ballooning it, this thing does a very competent job of making it look really solid, at least in the demos I've seen, and based on the mCable itself. So I'm looking forward to checking that out more. And the other thing that they made that kind of impressed me, and again, I'm not a PC gamer, as all of you guys know, but they did show this to me in a demo, and I thought this was kind of impressive. So the idea is this is not useless when it comes to PC gaming, because PC gaming, you don't necessarily need this. If you have, a 4K compatible console, like you have the best graphics card out there, you can run everything at like 120 frames per second or whatever in 4K. That's not for you. That's not what this is. But if you're running let's say you're running an older computer, like say a couple of years ago you bought a tower, and then there's a new game coming out, and no longer are you able to run the game. The specs are just too much for your computer. You obviously can upgrade your computer, or you can use this as the upgrade, which is kind of interesting. So they showed this to me. They had like a 2014 Dell tower in there, and they were running GTA 5 on it. When they tried to run the game at 30 frames per second at 1080p, it was too choppy, it could not operate, it was too slow, and it was unstable. So they ran it down at 720p, and then the frame rate was smooth. So then they added this, and the mClassic would upscale it to 1440p, so you're still getting 30 frames per second, and you're getting 1440p. Granted, not native 1440p, but it did look obviously better compared to what the, when they did a dual split of the screen. One was running 720p, the native, and the other one was running with mClassic at the upscaled 1440p. It was noticeably better, but they were now both running at a smooth frame rate. So what I'm saying is, if you have an older gaming PC and you want to play something modern, this is kind of a nice half-step way to kind of upgrade and get more out of the current computer rather than having to buy an entirely new rig. But that's an option. But again, this thing is focused more on consoles than it is on PCs, though it does have PC benefits. So if it's anything like the mCable, I'm very excited to see what kind of improvements it will have. I'm kind of betting off the bat that the ones that it's going to have the most return on is 6th gen stuff, GameCube, Dreamcast, Xbox, PS2 to an extent. PS2 doesn't support 480i or 480p in most cases. But anyway, the point is I'm going to fire it up and test it out, and we'll take a look at it. So I've been using this thing for a while now, and it's time for final thoughts. And I've got a lot to say, so grab a drink or something. So first of all, I have to say that this thing does exactly what it says it's going to do. It offers enhanced color depth. It offers enhanced resolution. It removes jagged edges. It offers a much better overall picture once you have it connected to whatever your device is and you have it all configured appropriately. It's also very easy to use. I mean, again, it's plug and play for the most part. Now, you have to keep something in mind here. Despite being called the mClassic, despite having a retro mode, they do treat that more like it's a bonus. This thing's clearly marketed and intended more for the last 2 generations of consoles, namely the ones that are HDMI natively compliant. You know, the Xbox One, the PS4, the PS3, Xbox 360, Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Wii U. Because those are just plug and play, and then you can do minor adjustments we'll talk about later, and you're done. The retro stuff is really just more of a bonus because of how good it can make retro content look, provided you have the right setup, so we'll get into that. First, from a usage standpoint, like I said, easy to use, really didn't run into any problems, except for one, which was the retro mode specifically. Like I said, you switch the little toggle over, and it's supposed to adjust to 4:3. And in almost all instances, that's exactly how it worked. I didn't have any problem. But for some reason, namely with the N64, for some reason it would only partially do it. Instead of taking, it stretches to 16:9, no problem, you put in the retro mode, right? It's supposed to take it to 4:3. It only took it to like halfway there. I don't know why. But I can only assume that has something to do with the sheer number of random things you have to connect from the N64 to the mClassic to make it work, which we get into that part now. Keep in mind, obviously my channel is largely about retro gaming, so it makes sense that I'm going to focus more on this side of things. But if you want retro content, you are going to require third-party adapters, which I can't say is the fault of this thing. Like I said, it doesn't market itself as that. It's just, you know, especially for the price point, it's $100. I think early access backers get it for $80. It's not meant to be this all-purpose singular solution like, say, the FrameMeister or something like that. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's better than the FrameMeister, at least as far as the video output ends up being. But if it was the all-in-one solution, it would probably be a lot more expensive. So keep that in mind. This thing is at its best when you have the right pieces of tech to go with it. So let's say legacy connections. Now, every console prior to the Xbox 360 that is compatible with this thing will require some sort of adapter to make that work, because none of them have native HDMI output. Things like I don't want to say the pound cable, but in some instances that will be the way. Some ways it's the retro tank is a good option. Other ones it's like there's special ones specifically for that console, which we'll go over more in a minute. But the point is, anything non-HDMI compliant natively will require some sort of blank console to HDMI adapter. And what you want to do in all instances is get the best one available, because if you're getting a cheap, crappy one that's downgrading the image, then the mClassic has to work with a poorer image, and you won't end up with the results you want. So in all cases, it's kind of a case-by-case basis where you kind of need to know the appropriate pieces. And the next piece of the puzzle you need to understand about this particular device is the resolutions that it supports. It supports 4, and this is important. It supports 480p, 576p, which is a nice bonus because that's a PAL resolution, 720p, as well as 1080p. Now, if it detects any of those 4 resolutions, that's when the mClassic switches into place and it goes, all right, I'm going to do color depth enhancement. I'm going to remove jagged edges. I'm going to enhance the resolution. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to process this image. In the case of 1080p, because this thing supports 1440p, if you have a 1440p monitor, it can take any of those 4 resolutions and clean it up and put it out at 1440p. Unfortunately, I do not have a 1440p monitor, and my 4K television does not support 1440p. So I could only see this based on the demo I saw at E3. But it looked really stellar. But in that instance, if you're saying, okay, well, I have a 4K TV or I have a 1080p TV, what does it do then with 1080p content? At that point, what it's going to do is detect, okay, you have a 4K TV, but it doesn't support 1440p, so we're only going to balloon your content to 1080p, but we'll do color enhancement. We will do removing of jagged edges. And the same thing is true if you have a 1080p TV and you give it a 1080p source. It's like, okay, can't change the resolution, but I can enhance the color, I can remove jagged edges, etc., etc. But if you have 1440p monitor, then you get an even greater level of enhancement, which is very cool, and I'm envious of you if you get to enjoy that. But the question is, what does it do with the resolutions it doesn't support? Things like 480i, 576i, 1080i, 240p. What does it do with those? The answer is nothing. It just bypasses them straight through, which is fine. It's just that you see no enhancements to anything with those resolutions. So sometimes that can be counterintuitive. Small example here, if you take the original Xbox, a console which if you wanted to, you could set to 1080i, and then you connected it to the mClassic through whatever means, it wouldn't do anything. But if you set it to 720p, which is a lower resolution, and then connect it to the mClassic, then all the enhancements would kick in and you start seeing all the benefits. So sometimes that can be counterintuitive. So just keep in mind, it supports those 4 resolutions. So you're going to want to make sure anything you connect to it is outputting to that resolution, which does present a bit of a problem. And it's time to explain how you're going to connect some sort of retro console to this thing. So, I should also mention while we're on the topic of passing things through, when it comes to the audio, the mClassic does nothing for audio. It just passes whatever the source is through, so you don't have to think too much about that. But okay, now back to the point. Let's talk about how to connect a retro console to this thing. Now, each console is going to have some sort of unique situation. We'll just use one example. Let's talk about the Nintendo GameCube. Now, the Nintendo GameCube originally had a whole host of different ways to be displayed, and let's give you an example of what the possible benefits of the mClassic would be compared to some of these connections. So first up, this is the Nintendo GameCube running with composite. This is the yellow cables. This is how you remember it. This is what you likely had when you were a kid. This is how you were probably playing it. And it's gross. It is really bad. But, I mean, that was composite. That's just how it was. We didn't know any better. Nintendo fortunately did offer some options. They gave us S-Video. Now, S-Video was an improvement. It separated the color from the contrast. It resulted in a sharper picture, but still was not like, it didn't blow your socks off. It wasn't amazing. It was just better. But, you know, it was there. The next thing over was RGB SCART. Now, this is just kind of, I just threw this in here mostly for PAL users because only European GameCubes, and I think Australian GameCubes, supported this. In North America and in Japan, we didn't have this mode at all, so we couldn't even access it. But RGB SCART out of the GameCube had better color, it had better separation from contrast, and it was just an overall sharper image. But really what you wanted was component. Now, the component signal, ironically, did not exist in the PAL regions. This only existed in North America and in Japan. But that was really sweet because it had the progressive scan modes. So about half of the games on GameCube support 480p as opposed to just 480i. Now when they're in 480p, you get the enhanced resolution and it looks amazing. And especially because, like I said, this device doesn't kick in until it detects at least 480p. But the problem with 480p on the GameCube was that the component port itself, Nintendo did not make nearly enough component cables. In fact, it was so unpopular at the time, they eventually stripped the port out entirely and just left production without it for a few years, even though certain games continued to support that. The point is, you couldn't really access it very affordably. And until recently, we didn't have alternative options. Now, what we now have is something called the GCHD. And we also have things like the Carby, and this is what they look like. Basically, they're HDMI solutions that just plug right into the back of the GameCube, and they tap into the fact that the component signal is there. They do a very good job of adapting from component over to HDMI, and then boom, you can run it that way. Now, this is the point where you can connect the mClassic. So you take the GameCube, you take the GCHD, and you take the mClassic, put it together. What do you get? You get this. And it is a stunning improvement because the GCHD is still just putting out the original source, whereas the mClassic goes in, takes the resolution, enhances it, does removal of jagged edges, improves color depth, etc. I actually got to see this exact same demo, well, a demo of the GameCube, running at E3 on a 1440p monitor. It was insane that they could make it look that good. Now, I'm limited to 1080p, but still, it looked amazing. But now you get it. That's the basic point. In almost all instances, with anything prior to the Xbox 360, you're going to have to go through some sort of hoop like that. Now again, this is really how the retro market, we're kind of used to doing this. We're kind of used to having all these little toys that we have to connect. And fortunately, we live in a time where there are a whole bunch of toys that make this type of thing possible. But also, we live in a time where there's a lot of really bad options too. So you have to approach it on a case-by-case basis, and some are easier than others. The Dreamcast, for example, is an easy one. All you'd have to do with it is take that. Almost every game on that system supports progressive scan. So all you have to do is take there's VGA boxes, but what I recommend is one called the Gecko. That's an HDMI box by the Bahar Bros. You plug it in the back of your Dreamcast, you plug the mClassic in it, boom, you're done. And almost every single game will work, and almost every single game will be enhanced as a result of it. That's an easy case. There are other HDMI solutions for the Dreamcast that I highly do not recommend. Things like the pound cable or the hyperkin cable. Those introduce visual errors that do not need to exist, whereas the Bahar Bros ones do not do that. So you got to be careful with that. Then there's consoles where you know it can be amazing, like the original Xbox, but the problem is no one has made a good HDMI solution for the original Xbox yet. There's the pound cable, there's the hyperkin cable, and those are at best 70% of the way there. They just introduce things that aren't supposed to be there. No one's made a good one yet. But if you were to attach the mClassic to those, the mClassic would enhance, but it's enhancing from an already broken image, if that makes any sense. PlayStation 2 is a perfect example of a complete nightmare when it comes to trying to do anything with, not to the fault of the mClassic, but just due to the fault of the PS2. PlayStation 2 has about 5,000 games on it. Less than 200 support progressive scan modes, meaning almost all of them are locked at 480i, meaning if they were to somehow attach directly to the mClassic, they wouldn't do anything. But there is ways around this. If you take the PlayStation 2, you put it in RGB mode, you set HD Retrovision cables, they're very good component cables, connect that to a RetroTink, which I've done a video on previously. The RetroTink will do what's called line doubling. It'll take the 480i signal output to 480p. And it will also do some additional smoothing to buff out some of the jagged edges. So once it does that, you can attach the mClassic to it. It will do even more, and the image will be much better. And unfortunately, I think everything prior to the Dreamcast, you're going to have to do something like that, because every console prior to the Dreamcast doesn't operate at 480p. They operate at 480i or much lower. And as we stated, with the mClassic's lowest natively supported resolution is 480p. So in a lot of instances, what you're going to have to do is take something like the RetroTink and make it work like that. And that goes on a case-by-case basis. There are certain examples of certain things like the N64 now. We have the Super 64 by Eon, which I just did a video on, and the mClassic makes that look ridiculously good. But yeah, those types of things will be necessary to get the most out of your mClassic if you care about the retro content aspect of it. So the next thing to discuss, and we kind of touched on it a little bit with the original Xbox there, is adjusting of resolutions. Now, this is going to seem kind of counterintuitive, but let me explain. If you want to take something like the original Wii, almost every game on the original Wii runs at 480p. However, you can stick them into the Wii U, and the Wii U will be like, all right, that's a Wii game. I'm just going to balloon that up to 1080p, put it out through HDMI, and you're good to go. And the Wii U does do some additional processing, and you get a better image than you would have out of the Nintendo Wii. The problem is, if you were to connect the mClassic to the console at that point, the mClassic goes, okay, that's already 1080p, so I'm only going to be able to do this much to it. Whereas, counterintuitive as it might seem, were you to go into the Wii U, provided you're playing an original Wii game, set it to 480p, its native resolution, then let the mClassic do the processing, the image quality is much better because, frankly, this thing's processing ability of upscaling is much, much better than Nintendo's inside of the Wii U. And that process basically applies to pretty much any console that they basically designed it for. So, in the case of the PS3, despite being a 1080p console, almost every single game on it only runs at 720p. So what are you supposed to do? Set it to 720p, and then let this thing do the additional enhancements. Because essentially, if you don't change it, you're letting the mClassic wear a hat on a hat. Whereas if you set it to its native output and then let the mClassic do all the work, it's just so much better at handling it than the console kind of diluting that process. The same thing goes for the Xbox 360. While it had more 1080p games, the vast majority were 720p, so in almost all instances, you would want to set the console to 720p. The same also applies to the Nintendo Switch. Almost every game on the Switch only runs at 720p, particularly in handheld mode. Now, some of them run at like 900p when they're docked, but almost none of them run at 1080p. So in most cases, what you're going to want to do is set it down to 720p and then let the mClassic take over. The Wii U, I think, ironically, is kind of an exception to this, because I think most Wii U, like actual Wii U games, not backwards compatible Wii games, but actual Wii U games run at 1080p. So that one, ironically, you'd probably just leave it the way it was. And then with the like I said, PS4 and Xbox One, though, are a little bit different. Those two, you're not going to notice a whole lot of difference when it comes to resolution enhancement because they're already running at 1080p, and in the case of the Xbox One X and I think PS4 Pro, they can actually run at 1440p. So the only thing the mClassic's going to do is enhance color depth and enhance, like, remove some jagged edges and stuff. It's one of those things where it won't be super obvious at first, but after you've been playing it with the mClassic for a while and you go back to it without, you'll be like, let's put that back in there. Trust me, it gets kind of addictive. You end up liking it with the benefits in there. So that about does it for that type of thing. So really the only other points I can make is one thing to note, because of the way this thing is, rather than the mCable, which the way I set my system up was I had all my consoles, they're all running up to a series of HDMI switchers, which all feed into one last HDMI switch box. And then from there, the last cable out was the mCable, which feeds right into the TV. So this is going to be the exact same basic setup. Instead of having the mCable at the very end of the process, what I'm going to do is have the mClassic be at the end of the process. So I can still get all the visual benefits without having to buy like 100 mClassics, which is nice. And I'm sure people will ask, what happens if you put an mCable into an mClassic? It doesn't really, as far as I could tell, it doesn't really seem to do much. There could be some enhancements in some scenarios, but as far as I can tell, it's another hat on a hat type of thing. I don't think you really need it. The mClassic does what the mCable does, but better. So it's kind of pointless. So the only other thing I think I want to do at this point is just show you examples of game consoles running with and without it. Rather than show the whole GameCube, like the gauntlet of everything it can run with, what I'm going to do is show you what was previously the best way to play any given game console, then with the mClassic. As we do this, it's time, I think this is a good opportunity to kind of point out the other benefit of this thing is that it's basically a future-proofing device, because a lot of our older consoles, they run at such low resolutions. Modern TVs are getting less and less compatible with them every day, so you need to find a way to adjust the resolution so that you, at the very least, can play the game. The mClassic is nice. In addition to being able to make that possible, you can actually enhance the gaming experience, but once again, provided you have the appropriate legacy connectors. But you got to think about that for the future, guys, because eventually we're going to reach a point, and we've already sort of gotten there. Modern TVs a lot of the time simply do not have composite ports on them anymore. They don't really have component ports on them anymore. So having the appropriate adapters and having something like the mClassic to make the resolution compatible is becoming more and more essential if you care, of course, about having, the original hardware, which, I think a lot of us do. But as we look at this footage here, the thing I want you to focus on the most is look around for jagged edges around stuff in the original footage. Look at things like color depth as it truly changes. Resolution is hard to present in this form, but the resolution does increase, but that's more visible on an actual television when compared to the other, because here you're looking at a small little YouTube screen, which again, you have to be reminded, has been compressed. It has been captured. It has been compressed. It has been compressed again by YouTube after being compressed by editing software. Just keep that in mind. This is going to give you an idea of it, but nothing beats a side-by-side demo, which if you ever have the chance, you should definitely look into that possibility. And I'm sure people will ask this, what's the lag situation? They describe it on the box as having less than 0.0001 millisecond of lag, or at least that was on the website somewhere. I certainly didn't notice any while playing with it, so I don't really think that's a factor. I do get why people could be concerned with so many different adapters and things connecting, and that is a potential possibility. That wouldn't be the fault of the mClassic, that would be the fault of a possible bad third-party device. But at least in the setups I've been using, I really didn't run into anything like that. And another point to make would be about 4K content. I'm sure people will ask, because it says right on there it does 4K content. But really what it seems to mean by that is, based on the website anyway, is that it tends to, that's more for Blu-ray content. So namely, what you can do is you can take a 2K Blu-ray, run it through this thing, and it will actually upscale to 4K, and it actually cleans it up really nicely. It doesn't seem to do that with gaming content. I think I don't know entirely why, I guess, but it seems to do that very well with Blu-ray content, which is a nice bonus if you're into films, of course. Then it does work very nice. But if you have other 4K content, like say you take the PS4 Pro or the Xbox One X and you're running them in 4K and you run them through the mClassic, it's, as far as I can tell, just passes right through and doesn't really do the enhancements unless you're watching a Blu-ray, at least as far as I've noticed. But again, diminishing returns. With those consoles, the effects are going to be minor. They're going to be things like better color depth and stuff like that, but resolution change, not so much. So what we're going to do now is I've got a lot of gameplay footage here. I just want to show you guys comparisons one after the other. So I'd like to also take a moment just to remind you guys, if you can, please like and subscribe the video. I really appreciate that. Always check out my social media stuff down below, and I'll catch you guys in a little bit towards the end. Alright, so as you can see there was a lot of stuff in that. Hopefully you noticed a lot of the enhancements. In some cases it's more obvious than others. Some cases it's like really obvious. So I overall do recommend the mClassic. I'll put a link in the description if you want to go ahead and check it out. Like I said, I think early backers right now get it for $80 instead of $100, so that's cool. Thank you over to the guys at Marseille Inc. for hooking me up with this, again, for the purposes of review. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.